Now we are going to begin our last session about Utah digital newspapers.
Cool. Hello again. My name is Harish Maringanti. I'm the Associate Dean here, and Jeremy Myntti, he's the head of our digital library services. And before I begin, I must acknowledge and thank folks from Digital Library Services. Many of them are here in the audience today. What you're going to see is the product of their hard work. So thank you. And so how many of you have know about Utah digital newspapers? I bet most of you, right? So we thought this would be a good time to, we are involved in many projects, and to give you a high-level picture, broadly speaking, we have focused our efforts in two different areas as it relates to Utah digital newspapers. One is adding more content to our collections, and the second one is what to do with the content. So as we go through the presentation, we'll touch on both of those themes. So it all began in 2001. 2001 is when we got hold of Content DM, and I think we were perhaps one of the first research universities that started Content DM way back then. It had a lot of good features at that time, and once we had a stable platform, the next step was to see what we can build around the system, and that's where we launched UDN, or Utah Digital Newspapers. Many of you may know John Herbert and Kenning Artledge. They were the pioneers and leaders who started this program. And so in 2002, we were lucky enough to get funding from the state through the LSTA grant. And the idea was to digitize 3 weekly newspapers covering a period of roughly 30 years. And they approximately had 30,000 pages. So 3, 3, and 3. So they, that was the original intent, and the project was very successful back in the day. Because of the initial successes, they were able to apply for another big grant later in 2003, and that jump-started the program and took it to the national level. And after that, we started seeing NDNP and Library of Congress getting involved, and the whole digital newspapers project went national after that. We were able to create a lot of partnerships between 2003 and 2010 by working with historical societies, museums, and a bunch of other nonprofit organizations at the state. And in 2010, we reached the landmark. We were able to hit 1 million pages. So on the outside, this was all good, but behind the scene, we started seeing some scalability issues, because one of the unique aspects of our digital newspapers collections is that we get data at the article level. So we do scan pages, but we do extract articles, segment the articles, and store everything as individual objects. So even though we may have 1 or 1.5 million pages, when we talk about each article being an object into itself, we are looking at 15, 20 million objects pretty quickly. And Content DM wasn't built to scale to that level. So we had lots of issues. 2015, we were faced with this decision. We had lots of consulting sessions with Content DM, and it was very clear that they were not built to support repositories of that scale. And we had some interesting discussions too. We had to put in some money to upgrade our servers and storage infrastructure. And that all came back to the impact factor, right? It was good that we had 1 million pages, over 15 million objects, but for me to make that case to the dean, to my dean, saying that I needed money to upgrade the infrastructure, I had to show things more than just the numbers, right? So it has the impact, which is the theme of this conference, right? It has some real tangible connections with the funding. if we want to sustain these programs, I think we need to be able to articulate how these projects have an impact on our user communities. Luckily, at that point, we were in the middle of migrating our servers, upgrading our websites too, so we were able to gather some testimonials from the user community, and we were able to use it and convince both the campus leadership and our leadership that this was a worthy investment. And subsequently, after we upgraded the servers, that was the time that we had to migrate away from Content DM. Again, basic indexing job was taking more than a week or more than 10 days, and our folks were very frustrated. It was like we weren't making investments where we really needed to make. So we were lucky enough to have talented staff, both on the metadata side, on the technical side. They got together and decided to build the Solfal, build the system. It's homegrown, and I'll get to why we decided to go that route rather than, say, migrating directly to Hydra / Samvera or any other platform at that time. So we were able to whip up a system very quickly, do the migration within 6 months, and everything seemed to be working well. And between 2015 and 2016 is when we started looking very closely at what the future of these projects was going to be, right? We are adding content, we know how to digitize, we know how to add metadata, we can run through the projects very quickly, so everything was good in terms of workflows, in terms of operationalizing some of the complicated problems. But what do we do? I mean, we have this content, now what else can we do with the content? So at that point, we talked about maybe developing some APIs on some of the collections. Now, Library of Congress and a few other institutions have developed their own APIs too. But again, one unique aspect of our collections is the fact that we have article level data. And none of the APIs out there at that time could output articles. So we thought this was a good opportunity to start taking some baby steps towards collections as data concept back in 2016. So we did the API. You will see examples of API. So I'm not going to get into the technical details of the API, but I wanted to take a couple of minutes to talk about why we need to be doing this. Again, it's like preaching to the choir here. You already know. But I thought it would be relevant to pull quotes from leaders in this field who have talked about why it makes sense for libraries to be starting to think about collections in different ways. So I'll begin with something that Michel Whitelaw, he's an associate professor in the School of Art and Design at Australian National University. And he was talking about the way search works right now on library collections. So pretty much wherever you go, any library website, or perhaps any website, you invariably come across the search box, right? And he had something to say about that. He said, search fails to match the ample abundance of our digital collections and the generous ethos of the institutions that hold them. A more generous interface would do more to represent the scale and richness of its collections. It would open the doors, tear down the drab lobby. Instead of demanding a query, it would offer multiple ways in and support exploration as well as the focused inquiry where search excels. So he was, again, I think even though it looks like criticism of the search interfaces, there's more meaning behind it, right? I think we ought to be doing something than just merely slapping a search box on our interfaces and patting ourselves on the back, right? And in a similar context, Dan Cohen, who many of you may know, he was the founding director of DPLA, and right now he's the Dean of University Libraries at Northeastern University. He articulated the benefits of APIs in the digital humanities context this way. Unlike other forms of access, APIs encourage the kind of energetic and creative grassroots and third-party development that in the long run maximizes the value and utility of a digital resource or tool. Motivated by many different goals and employing many different methodologies, users of APIs often take digital resources or tools in directions completely unforeseen by their owners. And Kinzer was alluding to that point earlier today too. And he continues, new resources based on these APIs appear weekly, some of them hinting at new methods for digital research, data visualization techniques, and novel ways to data mine texts and synthesize knowledge. So, I mean, that's the context behind why we ought to be doing these things, right? Now, I work in IT, in library, and to me, this goes much beyond just thinking about APIs for collections. And I wanted to refer to David Weinberger. He's a senior researcher at Berkman Klein Center for Internet and Society at Harvard University. He talked about libraries as platforms. Now, in his own words, he says, the key is to think of library not as a portal that we go through on occasions, right? But as infrastructures that are as ubiquitous and as persistent as streets and sidewalks on towns or classrooms and yards in a university, right? I think that's the goal. It's not about just thinking about APIs or one other technology, maybe IIIF or something else, and integrating it into our collections. It's about how do we flip the switch? How do we get these things baked into the core infrastructure that we can offer to our users? So that was in 2016. In 2017, we took the next step. We were fortunate to get funding for a project to develop newspapers functionality in Samvera. And this is the reason why we did not immediately jump from Content DM to Samvera or Islandora, because some of the open source solutions out there right now, they do not have the level of functionality that we needed to expose the granular, rich information that we have in newspapers. And given that we had over 20 or 22 million articles, we just didn't want to just dump everything in one of these platforms and try to figure out a solution later. Again, we were fortunate enough to come up with a solution that would keep us afloat for 3 to 5 years, and then slowly figure out how to use one of the existing community-driven frameworks to get what we needed. But in the same time, try to give back to the community. So this is a joint partnership with the Boston Public Library. They already have experience working with Samvera, and this was a good opportunity because we had lots of newspaper content. So we felt this was a perfect partnership, and we were able to convince IMLS to award us some funding. We are in the middle of this grant. Hopefully we will have some code to demonstrate in the next few months. So we'll keep posting some updates. If anyone is interested, just let me know and I'll put you in touch with folks who are working on this project. With that, I'll hand off to Jeremy. Sure.
All right, so as Harish mentioned, by 2017 we had a lot of newspaper content that we could throw at a system like this Samvera system that they're working on developing right now. Right about the same time that grant was awarded, we were able to ingest the 2 millionth page into UDN. When we ingested the 1 millionth page in 2010, we were the biggest statewide digital repository of newspapers. By this point, there's a couple that are a little bit ahead of us, but not too many. But we're still trying to compete in that. One day we'll be the biggest again. Fingers crossed. Another big thing that we did in 2017 was redesign the digitalnewspapers.org website. If you've been a user of that site, you may have noticed that it's been pretty static for the last decade or so. There's been very minimal changes. I think the latest version in the background there was designed in about 2007, 2008. So we thought it's time to revamp this, to make it much more modern, to make it more user-friendly, see what we could do with current technologies, rather than the old technologies from just a decade ago. So you can see there in the foreground we have what the new website looks like for digitalnewspapers.org. It's a totally different looking site. We tried to go off of the state flag a little bit, utilizing those colors, using a logo of like a digital beehive, honeycomb kind of thing to represent Utah. So we went live with that site last November, and if you haven't checked it out, please go to it, look at it, let us know what you think, and if there's any other things you think might be good to implement, and we can see what we can do with that. As Harish mentioned, we have this great API around UDN now to be able to play with the data outside of the regular patron-facing system. So two of the main things that have been done with this API so far is on the left there, you can see we've created a Twitter bot that can go into UDN every day and find some newspaper article from some point in history of Utah on that day, pull it into Twitter and just send out a tweet every single day about that. If you haven't followed us on here and you're on Twitter, go ahead and follow at Utah Dig News. And there should be a new article on there every day that you can take a look at. Another thing that's been done with the API is on the new website, you can see there in the middle that image for on this day. It's doing kind of the same thing as the Twitter bot, but what it's doing is creating a timeline of every day when you go to that site. It'll show, today it would show July 11th from 1858, 1868, 1878, any newspaper articles or pages that it can find for those days, and just show it to you on there, just as kind of a fun little on this day in history. I'm not sure how many people are really using that. We need to look at our usage statistics, but we thought it was a fun little widget to add to the website. So through all of these projects and over the last, what's been 17 years working on Utah digital newspapers, we're currently just barely under 2.5 million pages. So that means in the last year we've added about 500,000 pages to the UDN program. As Harish mentioned, a lot of it in the beginning was article segmented. We have over 20 million articles. Content that's being added over the last few years is only page level newspapers rather than article segmentation. We did some user studies and looked at the goals of the program, looked at other digital repositories of newspapers to see what might be best. And at that point, we decided that doing the article segmentation wasn't necessarily worth the high cost of that. So all new content is just page level rather than article level. We have around 160 newspaper titles, depending on how you count a title, with all the title changes and whatnot, especially with newspapers like this. And most of the papers that we have in UDN are unique. They're not in Chronicling America or not available anywhere else. So to accomplish all of this work of digitizing these newspapers, we've been partnering with Ancestry, and previously iArchives, which was bought by Ancestry, to get all of this digitization completed. About a little over a year ago, we signed a new contract with Ancestry to be able to get a lot of free digitization through some sharing of content here and there. So we are currently partnering with them to have about 1 million pages digitized for free for us. Of the 1 million pages with this project in the last year, I think we have around 200,000 credits left for 200,000 more pages that we can do in the next while. So we've been saving those kind of credits to get the free digitization for smaller libraries, archives, and museums. There's a few more terms for bingo if you need them. Archives and museums, I know I needed those on mine. So we're partnering with the smaller organizations to be able to get that free digitization when they don't have a lot of the money to do that themselves. So some of the current projects that we've been working on for UDN with different institutions, you can see right here. So while I say that we do get the digitization from Ancestry for free digitization is just like a free puppy. There's so many more hidden costs that you're gonna have down the road. So with all of our server costs, the time to ingest it into our interface, there's a lot of things that we still have to pay for. So we've worked with different partners around the state to be able to get small grants to fund that part of the projects. So I believe So the Emery County Progress and the Lehigh Free Press are both USHRAP grants that were recently awarded. And I believe those projects start today, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, so you'll be seeing that content added to UDN in the very near future. The Tremont and Leader, I believe that was an LSTA grant that they were awarded, and that'll be coming online pretty soon. For other things like the Daily Utah Chronicle, since that's the University of Utah student newspaper, we're just biting the bullet on that one and fund it ourselves since it is our content. We've had up through, I think, 1972 of that in there, so now we're finishing up through 2004, 2009, 2004. And then the huge project that we're working on with UDN right now is the Daily Herald. You might remember last year, Catherine McIntyre at UVU was awarded an LSTA grant for doing part of the Daily Herald. I believe we did 1930 through 1950 with that grant. Since the Daily Herald is Utah County's big newspaper, Ancestry is located in Utah County, they want that content because they feel like we have 400 million newspaper pages online, but we don't have our local paper. What's wrong with this? So they were willing to work with us, and they have given us the digitization of probably between 500,000 and 700,000 pages of the Daily Herald with no strings attached. They are digitizing that right now. We were down at BYU just about a month ago, picked up 780 some odd reels of microfilm, took that to Ancestry. So by the end of the year, if we can get that content online, we'll be over 3 million pages in UDN. With all of these great projects that we've been working on, we've had some pretty recent publicity in several different newspapers and through a lot of different venues. The top one you can see just from last week, the Deseret News was writing about our project to add the Hill Air Force Base newspapers into UDN. There were a few other articles in other newspapers and online that discuss that, but it's great that these kind of projects are getting this wide publicity. We're able to show some impact through that by how it's reaching out to many different places. Another project Tina's worked on recently with the Midvale Historical Society Museum about getting some of their papers into UDN, and they put an article about that in the Midvale City Journal. We've also done a lot with the Park Record up in Park City to get all of their newspapers into UDN. And then the last one I just found a couple days ago, I thought that was interesting. It was an article from the Grand Junction, Colorado Daily Sentinel, where just the newspaper writer was using articles from UDN talking about a train robbery back in the 1800s. So UDN is getting publicity all over the web for different projects like this. So now that we've done all of this work, we kind of want to look to the future to see what's in store for UDN in the coming years. So one of the big things that we are looking at is we want to keep partnering with Ancestry. They've been doing a great job. They're a local company. They are very willing to work with us. But we're down to 200,000 or so credits left with them to get this free digitization. So what do we do after that? So we're in the initial stages of talking with them on how can we get all of the digital or all of the microfilm newspapers in Utah digitized and made available in UDN. With that project, they are having a pilot project with the Kansas Historical Society right now, where they have gone to Kansas, loaded up a truck of 11,000 reels of microfilm. They brought it back to Lehigh, and they're digitizing all of that for the Kansas Historical Society. Wouldn't that be great if they were able to do that for us? Just go to all of our repositories, take all of our microfilm newspapers, digitize all of that, and make it available for us to put into UDN, so it's a free online resource. So we're in the initial stages of talking with them about this type of contract. One of the big things, again, they are providing free digitization, but then what do we do with it? This could double, triple, or even more increase the size of UDN over the next couple of years. So how are we going to pay for that storage, for the server space for that? So we've been talking with a few different institutions. We have some funding available that we're looking at to see how we can pay for this annually going forward. So hopefully you can hear more about that project soon once we have the funding piece in place. If we do go with this project, we'll be able to go into every single one of your libraries. If you have any content that the Marriott Library doesn't have, or that BYU doesn't have, or even the Church History Library doesn't have, we've talked to them about this, then we would be able to use your microfilm as well, just so we can fill in all the gaps of all the newspapers that have ever been published in Utah that have been microfilmed. Another big project that we're looking at is partnering with the Utah Press Association. So we've been in conversations with them for about 2 years now. You may know that they have a lot of the more current newspapers in Utah available through their Utah News Search database. But even for Utah News Search, you need to be attached somehow to a library to get access to that. So what if we were able to take a lot of their content and put that into UDN as well? They've given us 1.7 million pages of newspapers that have been published in the last 15 or so years that hopefully we are able to add to UDN at some time in the future. Since they are from the last 15 or so years, we need to be working with the publishers to get permission to publish those freely online. So once we get going with that, I think there's 110 different titles that we would be able to add their content from 2004 through 2015 into UDN over the next couple of years. And then the last thing I want to just throw out there in the future for UDN. So I mentioned earlier that we're working on digitizing the Daily Utah Chronicle, the University of Utah student newspaper. Within the next couple of months, we should have that from the beginning up through 2004 available in UDN. We already have the Weber State signpost, I think up till 2014 or so in UDN. So that just got us thinking, what can we do for other student newspapers from other institutions throughout the state? Part of that came up when Tina and I were down at BYU a few weeks ago to pick up all that microfilm of the Daily Herald. We saw that you were digitizing the Daily Universe, so we thought, hey, why don't we put that into UDN? It's a Utah newspaper, and it's got a lot of great information that can be put in there. So we've talked to a few of you in here about getting your student newspapers in, so that might be something that we could pursue in the future to just add more great Utah content to UDN. And with that, that's our presentation about UDN over the years. Here's our contact information, and we can just open it up for any questions.
Yeah. So with your digitizing project, do you only use papers that are on microfilm?
Mostly. So with our partnership with Ancestry, they prefer microfilm because it's so much easier, so much cheaper to digitize. We've gone and looked at their operations. They can digitize, 10 million pages a month if it's on microfilm. We've had a few times where we've been working on a paper where there's a small gap where there's no microfilm that exists for maybe a year or two. So we've worked with them on digitizing from paper for those kind of things. They take so much longer, they would rather not do it. We're also looking at a pilot project to do some of that work in-house here rather than send it out to Ancestry as well. So if there's small gaps, we can fill in, but we would prefer working from microfilm.
Any other questions for Jeremy or Harish? Okay, I think with that, we're done.